What happens when two people running non-stop finally allow themselves to stop? Can slowing down for one quiet day change how they face everything that comes next? Hi everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to explore a rare moment of calm as Linda and Quang leave the pressure behind and return to their small house on the hill, planting vegetables, cleaning their home, harvesting fruit, and rediscovering what rest truly means. If you enjoy this kind of quiet, emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The drive up the hill is quiet, almost unusually so. The road curves gently, lined with trees that sway lightly in the breeze, and for once, neither Linda nor Quang is in a rush to arrive. The engine hums steadily, but inside the car, there is a rare stillness. No calls coming in, no messages lighting up the screen. Quang keeps his phone face down in the cup holder, something he hasn't done in a long time. When the house finally appears at the top of the hill, it feels smaller than Linda remembers, but warmer somehow. The wooden walls catch the morning light, and the roof glistens faintly with leftover dew. Linda steps out of the car first. The air up here is cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint smell of soil and wild grass. She takes a deep breath, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, as if afraid the feeling might disappear too quickly. "This place always makes time slow down," she says softly. Quang shuts the car door and looks around. The valley below is still half covered in mist, the world moving at a pace completely different from the construction site they left behind. "Or maybe it just reminds us that we don't always have to run," he replies. They unlock the door and step inside. The house is quiet, untouched for a while. A thin layer of dust rests on the table, and a few dry leaves have found their way in through the open windows. Linda sets her bag down and walks around, lightly touching the walls, the shelves, the familiar corners. Nothing here is grand or impressive, but everything feels honest. Instead of unpacking right away, Linda walks to the back door and peers outside. There's a small patch of land behind the house, uneven and slightly overgrown, but full of potential. She turns back to Quang, a small smile forming. "What if we plant something here?" she asks. "Just a few vegetables, nothing serious." Quang raises an eyebrow, amused. "We just got here." "That's exactly why," Linda says. "No deadlines, no pressure, just planting." Quang laughs quietly, but he nods. Moments later, they're outside, sleeves rolled up. Quang takes a small hoe and starts loosening the soil. The motion is slow and steady, very different from the hurried movements he's used to. Linda kneels nearby, breaking up clumps of dirt with her hands. The soil is cool, slightly damp, grounding. They talk as they work, but not about work. Linda mentions how her mother used to grow vegetables in neat rows, how she learned patience by waiting for the first sprouts to appear. Quang shares how he hasn't touched soil like this since he was a teenager, back when life felt simpler, before responsibilities stacked up one after another. "You know," Linda says, carefully placing seeds into the soil, "doing this makes me feel human again. Not just someone managing problems all the time." Quang pauses, resting his hands on the handle of the hoe. "I was thinking the same thing," he admits. "Out there, everything is about speed. Here, it's about time." When the small garden is finally planted, they sit on the steps behind the house, looking at their work. It's nothing impressive, just a few simple rows, but it feels like an accomplishment, a quiet one. They head back inside to clean the house. There's no plan, no schedule. Quang wipes down the table and chairs while Linda opens the windows, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms. Dust drifts away in the sunlight. As she reorganizes a shelf, Linda finds an old box tucked into the corner. She opens it and smiles. Inside are photos from years ago. The edges are worn, the colors slightly faded. Linda calls Quang over and they sit on the floor together, flipping through memories. One photo shows them standing side by side, younger, unsure, but hopeful. "I remember this day," Quang says. "I thought I had everything figured out." Linda laughs softly. "And I thought you were impossible to talk to." They linger on the photos longer than expected, sharing stories, teasing each other, rediscovering moments they hadn't thought about in years. The house begins to feel alive again, filled with voices and quiet laughter. By the time the sun climbs higher, hunger settles in. Instead of going anywhere, they decide to use what's already here. Outside, a few fruit trees are heavy with ripe produce. Quang reaches up to pick the fruit while Linda waits below, catching them carefully. "These don't rush either," Quang says, handing her a fruit. "They just grow when they're ready." Linda nods. "Maybe that's something we need to remember." They wash the fruit, arrange it on the table, and eat slowly. No screens, no interruptions. Just the sound of wind brushing against the windows and distant birds calling. Later in the afternoon, Linda steps out onto the porch again. The light has softened, casting long shadows across the hill. Quang joins her with 2 cups of tea. They sit side by side, not speaking at first, watching the valley below as the day eases toward evening. "I think coming here helps me breathe again," Linda says eventually. "It reminds me why I keep going." Quang takes a sip of tea, then looks out at the horizon. "And it reminds me that stopping doesn't mean giving up." The wind picks up slightly, carrying the scent of grass and earth. They sit there, quietly, letting the moment settle. For now, there is nothing else they need to do. The sky shifts almost without notice. One moment, it's still bright with late afternoon light, and the next, the colors begin to soften, blending into gentle shades of gold and pale blue. Linda remains seated on the porch steps, her hands wrapped around the warm cup of tea. Quang leans back slightly against the wooden pillar, his posture relaxed in a way it rarely is when they're in the city. For a long time, neither of them speaks. The silence isn't awkward. It feels earned. Linda watches the shadows stretch across the hill, creeping slowly toward the garden they planted earlier. The small rows of soil are barely visible now, but she knows they're there, waiting. "I keep thinking about how fast everything moves down there," she says quietly, breaking the stillness. "It's like if you slow down even a little, you're afraid everything will fall apart." Quang exhales slowly. "I used to believe that. Maybe I still do sometimes." He pauses, then adds, "But today feels different." Linda turns to look at him. "Different how?" "Like, even if we stop," he says, choosing his words carefully. "Things don't collapse. They just keep going. Maybe even better." Linda smiles faintly. She understands exactly what he means. At the construction site, every minute is measured, every decision heavy with consequence. Here, time feels wide open, forgiving. As evening settles in, the air grows cooler. Linda stands and stretches, then heads back inside. She lights a small lamp near the window, its warm glow spilling across the wooden floor. The house feels softer at night, more intimate. Quang follows, setting the empty cups aside. They decide to tidy up one last time before resting. Quang stacks a few books neatly on the shelf while Linda folds a blanket that had been draped over a chair. The movements are slow, unhurried. There's no sense of finishing quickly or moving on to the next thing. While organizing a drawer, Quang finds a small notebook. He flips through it absent-mindedly. Inside are notes, old sketches, half-written plans. Some are his, some are Linda's. "I forgot about this," he says, holding it up. Linda walks over and peers inside. We used to write ideas here, not just work ideas, life ideas. Quang nods. Trips we wanted to take, things we thought we'd do one day. They sit down together on the floor, the notebook resting between them. Linda flips a page and laughs softly. We were so confident and so impatient, Quang adds. They don't judge those past versions of themselves. Instead, there's a quiet affection in the way they look back. Those plans didn't all come true, but somehow, they led them here. Dinner is simple. Linda heats up something light, and they eat at the small table near the window. Outside, the last of the daylight fades, replaced by a calm, deep blue. A few lights flicker on in distant houses across the valley. I don't miss the noise, Linda says suddenly. Quang looks up. Me neither. After dinner, they step outside once more. The sky above the hill is clear, dotted with stars that are rarely visible from the city. Linda pulls the blanket around her shoulders, and Quang sits beside her. The night air is crisp, refreshing. You know, Linda says, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I'm afraid that if I let myself enjoy this too much, going back will be harder. Quang considers this. Maybe it will be, he admits. But maybe that's not a bad thing. She turns to him. What do you mean? If it's harder, he says slowly, it means we've remembered something important, something worth protecting. Linda doesn't answer right away. She watches a faint shooting star streak across the sky, quick and quiet. Then she nods. They sit there until the chill grows sharper. Eventually, they head inside and prepare for bed. The house creaks softly as it settles, familiar and comforting. Linda lies awake for a moment, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind brushing against the walls, distant insects humming. Quang lies beside her, staring up at the ceiling. His thoughts drift, not toward schedules or responsibilities, but toward the feeling he had earlier that day, with dirt on his hands and no urgency in his chest. Linda, he says quietly, yes? When we go back, let's not forget this. She turns toward him in the darkness. We won't, she replies. Even if things get loud again, this will still be here. Outside, the hill rests under the stars, unchanged, patient. The garden waits. The house holds its silence. And for tonight, that is enough.
Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.